All right, well, it's about time for us to begin our class this morning. Appreciate everybody sticking around so we can dive into the Word together. When I was on the road for work all of last week, I figured mathematically I spent about 24 hours in the car. And so I really appreciate BJ taking chapter 5. And then he texted me and on Wednesday night and said, well, we had really good discussion. I said, okay, great. So where do I need to pick up? And he was like, verse 6. And to try to keep us on track, I also need to get into chapter 6 if we can. But obviously for me, discussion is more important than necessarily rushing through the material, because that's how we learn, and appreciate everybody's input. So we're gonna dive back into that. But before we do, BJ, would you mind leading us in a prayer before we start?
Our Father in heaven, we love you and we thank you for your word. Father, we thank you for men like Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah, who were full of faith and who trusted in you. And Father, in learning of their actions and learning of their faith, we can take these same principles and learn how we can build up your body today. Father, I'm so thankful for Philip. I'm so thankful for the efforts that he puts into preparing this material and the way that he teaches and instructs this class. And Father, we pray that you'll be with him this morning. Father, we're thankful for the opportunity that we even get to gather together, to open up your word, to do so worry-free, to know that we will not be persecuted in any way for coming together of those of like faith and mind, and that we can encourage each other and build one another up. Father, be with us as we go through the study. Help us to be attentive. Help us to open up not just our Bibles, but to open up our minds and our hearts. It's in your Son's name we pray.
Amen. Thank you, BJ. So from where I understand, basically, we ended in sort of towards the beginning of chapter 5. And the first part of that chapter 5 is focused on the people. It's focused on Zerubbabel. And of course, we have all of the writings of Haggai and Zechariah, where it's all focused on sort of the Jewish perspective and what God desires for his people. And they kind of get a kick in the pants after about 15 years because they haven't been doing what they're supposed to be doing. They've let the fear get ahead of them and keep them from fulfilling the task which they came back to the land to do to begin with. But then we kind of shift perspective a little bit, starting in verse 6 through the end of the chapter, and we get more letters. And I know we've already had a few back and forth letters. There's a lot of writing going back and forth, and now we're sort of seeing it from the eyes of the Gentiles who are ruling over this system. And it's sort of a tense, on the edge of your seat sort of section, because they've gone 15 years. They're scared to death of these people in the land that are against them. And now we have another obstacle that's come up. And so when we leave off in that section, I think it's really important that we remember that he leaves this section and sort of switches perspectives with saying, but the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop with them until the report should reach Darius, and then answer be returned by letter concerning it. So God is watching over his people. They've obeyed him. They've started back the work, and even though there is going to be some friction in that, he is taking care of them. And I think that the sum of the end of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6 is really showing how, like, just at what scale that is happening. You know, sometimes it's easy for us to think, well, you know, God's watching over me. And, you know, we all kind of can acknowledge that. But when we think about the things that are in play, not just in the temple area and in Judea where these people are, but just on a global scale, the things that have had to happen and are going to happen that show that God is looking out for them. There's a lot of pieces in play. And I think God deserves every bit of credit for every piece that's in play, not just the one that we might see from our own limited vantage point. But so God's blessing is over the people. It says, but God was watching over the Jewish elders. The literal translation of that is the eye of the God is fixed on them. And it's similar to the language that will be used in Ezra 7, 6, and 28, where it talks about the hand of the Lord being upon them. This is not a passive thing where God's just kind of keeping an eye on him. He is fixed on them, and he is making sure that he is with them and guiding every part of the step, every step along the way. And then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, delivered the Lord's message to the people. I am with you. This is the Lord's declaration. This is showing God's presence extends just beyond the temple, just beyond the mercy seat, and just beyond Mount Zion. It's more than, I love the Lord's Supper talk this morning, this idea that it's not a physical place, it's bigger than that. And even at this time, there's an acknowledgement that there's a lot going on in the world, and God is present in all of it because he is sovereign. And so this extends just beyond the physical walls. It's not ever been about the physical walls and the physical rooms of the temple itself. Unlike national idols and gods, he's not limited or dependent upon the people. In contrast, they are completely dependent upon his blessing to succeed. And so then we're sort of switching perspective a little bit, and we're talking about these letters that are going back and forth. And there's some organization that's happening west of the Euphrates, because you got to think that the power center is over in what is modern day Iran, right, over in Persia. And that's the newest set of overlords over the Jews is all way far away from all this. And we read about this guy named Tattenai. And Tattenai is it's sort of ambiguous in the text, but from what we can see, the evidence points to it being a technical name rather than a surname. It's sort of like Mr. President. That's not his actual name, but it is something like, if I say Mr. President, everybody in this room knows who I'm talking about, right? And so it's a name that's sort of taken on. So one of the things that Darius does when he comes, Darius the Great, he restructures the entire empire. This is something that's very common for especially new rulers to do. If you're a linear king, and you just sort of ride on the coattails of your father as his father did before him, and you might do a little bit of tweaking here or there, and every once in a while in those lines, you'll get like somebody who's just really ambitious and wants to jump in there and do everything. But usually restructuring happens when a change has been made, whether maybe it's the second son who is a weaker son and he's trying to assert his power and fix things the way he wants them to run so he has more control over them. And this is what Darius is doing in between 522 and 520 in this early reign, around the time that this is happening. So there's a lot of moving parts going on. He's restructuring both the divisions of the empire. You got to remember that Persia is ruling over 40% of the global population at this time. This is almost half of the world is controlled by Persia. That's a lot of territory, and we've seen from Assyria and Babylon that takes a lot of work to be able to keep that running smoothly. And so he does some things to sort of tweak this and try to make it as smooth as possible and to establish his own power base. So the governors, satraps, and the leadership positions that are set up as part of this organization, there's a very distinct hierarchy and a very distinct chain of command. If you think, for the guys who have been in the military in here, you never just jumped, if you had a problem, you never jumped straight to the general, right? You go to the corporal goes to the sergeant goes on and so forth. And you do not jump over the other people that are in the middle of that chain, because that's the way that it runs as efficiently as possible. That's what it's there for. And this is sort of the same way. There are governors who are answering directly to the king. There are satraps who are answering to the governors, and so on and so forth. However, there's a cuneiform tablet dated to 502 BC, and it's a promissory note, which is sort of like a receipt in government. It would have been one of those things that probably gets stashed in modern day, gets stashed in a file folder, and then 20 years they have a big purge of the office and it just goes through the paper shredder. One of those sort of things, sort of a non-very consequential piece for the people at the time, but for us, it's interesting because it very distinctly says Tatenu, governor across the river. And it is widely understood that this Tattenai and Tatenu are the same person. And so this is a name or a variant of a name, probably the Hebrew variant of the Persian name, that does come up quite often. And we can still see these tablets. There are thousands of these tablets buried in museums across Europe. A lot of them come from the British Museum. And some of the things that we discover in biblical archaeology, it's just a matter of getting it out of the box. They've already dug it up. But there's so many of these that they just sit collecting dust for 50, 60, 100 years in some cases. And it's only when somebody has had the time to take that box off the shelf and start trying to read it that we start to see these really interesting patterns and confirmation of biblical history. And so in the historical record, this fragment archive says that he serves as the governor of a province beyond the river, similar to the text. One cuneiform tablet is a promissory note, and it addresses him specifically as the governor that's across the river. And it can be dated, interestingly enough, because of the way the Persians dated things, we actually can correspond that with the Julian calendar that we use today. And we know that this thing was actually written exactly on June 5th, 502 BC, right in the middle of the time frame that we're talking about. Specifically, if you use the celestial calendar and kind of count backwards, it's on a Wednesday. And I think that that's really neat because it puts real people in real places. So this Tattenai guy, this is the area that he is the area along the river is this area right here. It goes from the Euphrates River and basically goes all the way over to the Great Sea, up from Tarsus all the way down to Gaza. And so then you have Egypt over here would be its own province. Remember, Cambyses II conquers Egypt, and so that's brought into the fold. Arabia is kind of just a full bunch of desert nomads at the time. And then we've got, Asia Minor and Cilicia up here. And so this guy who's in charge of all this, he's in charge of quite a big swath. And so this inquiry that he sends to Darius shows that he's taking his job seriously, because out of all this space, he's concerned about this tiny little spot down here. And so in sort of kicking off our thought, what is the difference between Tattenai's response to the Jews? First, let's go ahead and read this next section, just so we get ahead of ourselves, before we get too far ahead of ourselves. Would somebody please read, let's do Ezra chapter 5, verses 6 through, let's go ahead and do 6 through 10, just to get us started.
This is the text of the letter that Tattenai, the governor of the region west of the Euphrates River, Shethar-Bozenai, and their colleagues, the officials in the region, sent to King Darius. And they sent him a report written as follows: To King Darius, all greetings. Let it be known to the king that we went to the house of the great God in the province of Judah. It is being built with cut stones, and its beams are being set in the walls. This work is being done diligently and succeeding through the people's efforts. So we questioned the elders and asked, who gave you the order to rebuild this temple and finish this structure? We also asked them for their names, so that we could write down the names of their leaders for your information.
Okay, so sort of starting out the gate, thinking back to the other letter that we read earlier, that's been written 15 years prior to a different king. What is the difference between Tattenai's letter and the letter that the enemies of the Hebrews wrote earlier? What were some thematic differences that we can see just in the initial approach that they have with Darius, or with the king at the time?
Well, he's not jumping to conclusions.
Right.
May call him a company man. He wants to figure it out first. The first letters, they just jump right into it and say, hey, we're against this. But he's thorough. He's a good administrator. He said, well, let's get some facts first before we shoot this letter off to Darius.
Right. So when he's writing this, he's not making these big leaps. You think about the one that's in chapter 4. What do they say is happening in the land?
They're going to take over.
Right. He doesn't just say like, yeah, they're building their temple. They're like, oh yeah, and they're building the walls, and they're doing this, and they're framing the letter to sort of give the king an uneasy feeling, right? Like, these are, go look at for yourself, king. These are rebellious people. They fill it in with background information that is meant to taint the observation of the king towards these people. But Tattenai doesn't do that. He's very simply on a fact-finding mission, right? It says that he's like, we've been down there. Here's the things that are happening. And he's very precise. He doesn't just say they're building the temple. He says they're building it with cut stones. They are raising it with timbers. He's very, very precise and doesn't blow things out of proportion. He's not exaggerating the way that the other letter does. Good. Any other things that we can notice from the difference between these two takes? BJ?
When I've read this down through the years, I've always been a little bit disappointed in Zerubbabel that he didn't do a little bit more to keep the work going.
I think after hearing Haggai and Zechariah, nobody is more disappointed in Zerubbabel than probably Zerubbabel. I agree. But that's just the human element of it, right? That's one of those things that we can relate to because we've all been in that situation. We all like to think that we would be these perfect, put in the position to be, the hero of God's people, that we would rise to the occasion. But Zerubbabel's a human being too, and he has those same challenges. I saw a few, BJ, Ronnie, and then Harold.
Tattenai doesn't appear to be an enemy. He just appears to be someone who's inquiring. And there's some, you and I have gone down some rabbit holes looking at some, possible connections between Tattenai and Haman and some other things, but that's all things that have not really been historically really supported a lot. When you just look at his role, he's just following orders. I mean, that's it. There's no animosity. There's no, pushback. It's not the same kind of obstruction that we've seen previously. And what we see here is really God's wisdom behind when he sent Haggai and Zechariah, right? God knew which people needed to be in place and when it was the right time to send the prophets to push them back, to get back to work, because he knew when it would be allowed to permitted to keep building. And so a lot of this is about God's wisdom, and I think we miss that when we look at the text sometimes.
Oh, agreed. And we'll kind of dive a little bit deeper into that, especially in chapter 6. You can see a lot of those parallels. Ronnie and then Harold.
The first letter to me was that they said, hey, you're not going to get any money from these guys. It says no tribute. And then not only that, they took it to next leaps. They took it beyond Jerusalem. They included them too. Said, you're going to get nothing this side of the river if you guys do this. So you're going to lose everything over here. That was kind of the approach at first letter.
Right. There's some implied threats, right? And think about the king that they're writing to, Cambyses. He's just gone through and started conquering Egypt, and so he relies on all of those close by, provinces that are giving him tribute to supply him not only with money but soldiers and a lot of other things. So there is a lot of sort of blackmail that's sort of happening underneath the timbre that we don't see in Tattenai. It's very, very succinctly just an administrative questionnaire.
I tell you guys, politics, like, hey, they're going to stop paying money, I don't even get money from us too.
Right.
I mean, it's not written there like that, but just seeing how people are in politics are, that's kind of the way I take it.
Right, and I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to think that Cambyses probably took it that way as well. There's a pretty good chance he probably did, because politics doesn't change, just the faces and the names. Harold?
Well, what I read into this in the description of the city being built, that he emphasized that it was going to be something permanent. They just wasn't throwing up a building. They were using the big stones and the big beams, and that's a lot of work to go into that, especially when all that stuff was done by hand.
Right.
So hey, these guys are serious about whatever it is that they got in mind.
Right, and it's not unreasonable for a governor of a province that large to wonder about something like that, right? It's, his job is to oversee the administration of all of the things that are going on in his province and in his region. And so when he sees there's some pretty significant permanent changes that are happening, he's going to kind of look into it. Now, think about this from the Jewish perspective, because it says that we sent people down there to talk to the elders. What do you think the reaction of the elders is when yet again they start building, and yet again some more foreigners come down and they start probing them with questions? It's sort of I know I would probably panic a little bit, but as of right, from what we can tell from the text, it's not animosity at this stage. But it would still make me nervous, I think, as a Jew. So this is a testament to the fact that they keep going even after they have this inquiry. And so we have another letter, and Tattenai's response, it's measured, right? It doesn't accuse them of anything. It doesn't jump to conclusions. It doesn't make inferences like the other system does. From the Persian tablets dating to the reign of Darius, the reforms he puts in place, like we said earlier, they have a very strict hierarchy. And so he sees something going on, and so what he wants to do is make sure that everything is on the up and up. He's not upset by the building like the enemies of Judah were, but he's kind of lightly concerned. He wants to make sure that all the I's are crossed and all the T's are dotted, or whatever the expression is. And he wants to make sure that they are authorized to do this. And so it's not, it might be annoying, but it's not antagonistic. This kind of makes me think of like a nosy HOA chairman asking if you got permission from planning and zoning to do whatever you're doing in the yard that you paid for, kind of thing. It's not necessarily that they're being aggressive and attacking them and trying to make it stop, but they're making sure, hey, you've got all the paperwork for this, right? This is all sort of what's happening down. And so we'll continue. So, and the other thing is that the work is being done diligently is something that he notes to the king. And I think that from a third party perspective, if someone else notices you working hard, you're probably working pretty hard. And so as they have started back into this, they're not just like Harold was saying, just sort of making something temporary and slapping something together. No, they're being diligent about this. They are putting in a lot of effort, and that's something that he notices, which is why it prompts him to write this letter. And then it says, this is the reply that they gave us. So we went down and we asked him some questions, and so this is him writing to Darius to tell Darius what the Jews are saying. There's a lot of back and forth, but this was the response of the Jewish elders that they talked to. We are the servants of the God of heavens and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and finished. But since our ancestors angered the God of heavens, he handed them over to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon. However, in the first year of King Cyrus of Babylon, he issued a decree to rebuild the house of God. And he took from the temple in Babylon the gold, the silver, the articles of God's house that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and carried them to the temple in Babylon. He released them from the temple in Babylon to a man named Sheshbazzar, the governor by appointment of King Cyrus. And Cyrus told them, take these articles, put them in the temple in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its original site. Then this same Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of God's house in Jerusalem. It has been under construction from that time until now, but it has not been completed. And so when they're questioned, the Jewish elders, they just say, here's the facts, right? So the leaders of the remnant, they basically give Tattenai and his men a brief synopsis of everything that's happened so far. And so, and he references Solomon, but not by name. He says a great king. It's clearly a reference to Solomon in 1 Kings 6. And they admit, and interestingly enough, they admit that it was their own rebellion, right? It's their own rebellion that got them into this pickle in the first place. And it's not a rebellion against the kings of men, but against the God of heaven. And I think that that's telling that in their response to the Persian king doesn't really need to know that, but they offer it up because they are acknowledging a recognition of their past, the sins of their forefathers, the thing that led them to this place. So they're trying to give him as much information as they can, as honestly and succinctly as they can. And then they cite the decree of Cyrus to release the captives and rebuild the city. And it's possible that they even showed the letters to Tattenai, actual articles in the house of God. There's all, they're there on site, so maybe they're looking at the plans. And then they say that Sheshbazzar was the one who did all this. And this gets kind of a little bit tricky because this is sort of the first time we've seen the name Sheshbazzar. And so there's a couple possibilities, and we're not going to debate them because it doesn't really matter to the tone of the letter. But just so that you know, this is either the actual initial governor that's sent back, or it's a different name for Zerubbabel. There are arguments both ways. I don't think it depending on which one it is, I don't think it changes anything textually about the message that's being presented before. But they're citing this so that way he has a name to apply to it, something to look up. And then it's still under construction to this day. So I like the note that BJ put in this slide, 16 years. I'm sure that Jonathan understands, this is a typical construction project, right? It's kind of gotten dragged out. We've hit some snags, and here we are. And so then in verse 17, so if it pleases the king, this is Tattenai finishing out his letter, let a search of the royal archives in Babylon be conducted to see if it is true that a decree was issued by King Cyrus to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. Let the king's decision regarding this matter be sent to us. So now this letter goes to Darius, and it's an inquiry that is designed to basically figure out if their claims are valid. They've put all this information in front of him, and he just wants to double check and make sure that all of this information is correct. So he's not trying to undermine the Jewish work here. He's trying to make sure that his head's not on the chopping block if they're not doing something they're supposed to be doing. Remember, we had all this restructuring. We have this hierarchy, and so he wants to make sure, hey, I'm not going to, they're allowed to do this, right? They say they are. They claim that they have a receipt from Cyrus. So could you please check on this, because he wants to make sure that he's just doing his job. And so the request is sent for the archives of Babylon to be searched. and to see if these things are actually so, and so they can validate or refute the claims that are being made one way or the other. And so if it's found in the records, it has to be honored, keeping with the law of the Medes and the Persians. From thinking back to like passages like Daniel or even Esther and the stories there, what is unique about the law of the Medes and the Persians compared to other empires before it and after it? Does anybody remember what's significant about how the Medes and the Persians made their laws?
There's no going back, right? Once there's a law or something down, you can change his mind, could change his mind, kind of thing.
Right, and yeah, basically it's a no take backsies, right? The idea is that when you think about Daniel, how they trick the king Darius the Mede, different Darius, they trick him into throwing Daniel into the lion's den, and the way they do that is he makes a law without looking over the implications very hard, and then when he wants to save Daniel, he spends all night looking for a loophole because they tell him, "Look, king, you made this law, and for 30 days you can't take it back." Like you can, after 30 days, he's free to do what he wants, but the law says for 30 days, no one bows to anybody but me. And he can't overrule that. And we'll get a little bit deeper into that here in a few minutes, but it's important to note that that's part of the reason they make the appeal to Cyrus. That's part of the reason that they make appeal to these orders that were standing, because a Persian king had said, yes, you can do this. And so that law, unless superseded by something technical, which is what happens in Esther, right? He can't take the law back that says, all the Jews are to be killed on this particular day. So what he does is he writes another law that says the Jews are allowed to defend themselves. So there will be no repercussions if the Jews kill the people who are trying to kill them. And it sort of becomes mutually assured destruction until the time stamp runs out. And that's the only way they can get around these laws, is by making other laws to counteract those laws. They can't take that one back. And so that's why they're appealing to Cyrus, because this law is still standing. And part of how Darius the Great is going to establish his true kingship by following the exact letter of the law without exception, unlike his predecessor, Cambyses II. We talked about how cruel he was and how awful he was when he conquers Egypt, and we can see the tone of his letter. And Darius is going to try to differentiate himself from that. And so while this is being verified, the work is permitted to continue in verse 5. And that brings us to chapter 6. So we've got a letter that's gone out to Darius. And now Darius, from his perspective, he's receiving a letter from a concerned governor who's looking for some clarification and doing his good due diligence. And Darius is asked to look into the matter and see if the Jews are, in fact, authorized to do this. And so bear in mind, now, there's been quite a bit of time that's passed since Cyrus put this thing down to tablet. We're approaching 20 years since these captives have been sent back. Once you account for all the couple of years that they were there working on the foundation before they stopped. And so we've got 4 reigns of 4 separate kings that have passed now. We're in the 4th reign of a different king who has completely restructured everything. And everything is being reorganized and changed. So would somebody like to please read for us Ezra 6, 1 through 5, so we can see what Darius's initial response is. Ezra 6, 1 through 5.
King Darius gave the order, and they searched the library of Babylon and the archives, but it was in the fortress of Ecbatana in the province of Media that a scroll was found with this record written on it. In the first year of King Cyrus, he issued a decree concerning the house of God in Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt as a place for offering sacrifices, and let its original foundations be retained. Its height is to be 90 feet, and its width 90, with 3 layers of cut stones and 1 of timber. The cost is to be paid from the royal treasury. The gold and silver articles of God's house of Nebuchadnezzar built in the temple in Jerusalem and carried to Babylon must also be returned. They are to be brought to the temple in Jerusalem where they belong, and put into the house of God. Thank you, Jacob.
Okay, so Darius goes looking for this tablet and goes looking to verify the question that is, it's another inquiry from another governor. He's got a lot of things going on, but he clearly spends a lot of effort finding the edict in this question. Why would Darius care about this particular edict to the point where he digs it up and finds out and then reads through all of the message? Think about what we've talked about with Darius and his kingship so far. What is his interest in making sure that this particular thing is, sorry, I'm getting all tongue-tied. What is the interest for Darius in taking a look at this request from a backwater province that's trying to build a temple? think about who he is, where he comes from, and what he's been doing for the last couple of years, because this is not very far into his reign. BJ?
I think just to get the ball rolling, Darius is trying to set himself apart as the clear ruler, over the Persian Empire. And we know the tricks he used to get into that position of power and how crazy things were before he even got to this position. But one of the ways that he can do that is by demonstrating, that he is, the law of the Medes and the Persians is going to be reflected, through his character and through his nature. So if someone says, hey, there's a law, that was made and we're not honoring, that's going to reflect on himself as the king. And so Darius, this is a reflection on his ability to lead and to reflect the law accurately, unless he looks into this appropriately.
Right. And when you understand the relationship of this empire with its laws, and we see this again over and over again in Daniel, and a lot in Esther, the entire premise for Esther is based on this very stringent adherence to their laws and their culture, is built around the system of law. Before this, in a lot of kingdoms, it's whatever the king says at any given time. The king is the divine supreme ruler. And the Persians have a little bit of a different take on it. It's the first step that we get towards a system of laws and government. The Babylonians sort of dabbled in this, but the Persians really perfect it. And so by taking the time to look into this matter and to double check the laws, they're creating a system where anybody can trust what's being said at any given time, and it smooths out the chaos. And so Darius is in a position where he's like, it might be a backwater province and it might just be a little inquiry. But by taking the initiative on the little things and going through the effort to find this and verify it, it shows that he cares about what the law says. He cares about what kings previous to him say. And that is the thing that he is trying to uphold in his reign, is that, like, look, the law is legitimate. I am the hero that is keeping this at the forefront compared to the last couple of kings. Good. Any other ideas or thoughts before we move on? Okay, so Darius seeks some answers. And this isn't just a simple internet search, right? We've talked about how they've done all this restructuring. Darius orders real care and searching to be overtaken, this final original edict, because the thing is, Persians are a little bit weird. Not weird for the time, but weird to us. We think of a capital city of a country being in the same place pretty much all the time. And they didn't work that way. They had 3 separate capitals in the Persian Empire, depending on how hot it was outside, basically. So Ecbatana is up in the north, and it's up in a higher altitude where it's not quite as close to the desert winds, and so it's a little cooler in the summertime. And so Ecbatana becomes the summer capital of the Persian kings, but they also have Persepolis and Susa. Susa is the oldest one, and that's sort of the pride and glory of Cyrus the Great. And then Persepolis, which is sort of being built in this period, but eventually it's going to become sort of a big deal, especially when the Greeks are arriving on the scene. And so they've got 3 large cities where the government's moving every couple of seasons to move around. So it's not like they can just go into one library and look it up. There are millions of these clay tablets that we have today, and that's not including the ones that got smashed, buried, thrown away, refired into something else, launched from a catapult in battle. Who knows? There's so many tablets that they've got to sort through. This is not a simple, easy task for him to accomplish. He goes out of his way to make this happen, which is, I think, why they specify we found it at this city, just in case anybody needs to find it again. It's here. And so he finds this original edict. Now, Darius's position, like BJ was alluding to, is tenuous. This is early in his reign, and he doesn't really have a legal claim to the throne. He's related distantly to the ruling family, but he is nowhere close to the technical line of succession. There's no universe where enough people would die where he would become king naturally. And so he spends his early reign maneuvering himself to legitimize his hold on power. You guys remember Bardia? We talked about this guy a little bit. So there's a little bit of discrepancy whether he was an imposter or whether he was the son of Cyrus II. And the reason there is that discrepancy is that the stories of him being a pretender, a usurper, they only appear after Darius becomes king. And so this is a narrative that Darius himself pushes to legitimize his claim. And scholars actually believe that Bardia is the son of Cambyses, and that he was legitimately ruler, but he was overthrown by Darius and those 7 other nobles. And so the narrative that Darius is spinning is Bardia was a lying pretender. I am the honest savior of the empire. And so once he's in power, he spends the early years trying to differentiate himself from these previous kings. Cambyses was disrespectful to the Egyptians and their gods. He tore down their temples. He made them worship him as a Persian, not as an Egyptian, all sorts of things to spit in the face of Egypt. And Darius goes down to Egypt and he presents himself as the true Pharaoh. He returns their gods to them and he allows them to continue building on the temple. This is something that he has made a habit of doing already. And now we're seeing the instance of it from the Jewish perspective. And he does this so much that there's actually this really famous large, I mean, this thing is bigger than Mount Rushmore as far as like span and space. It's that kind of a colossal structure. And you see all this writing. He is written in 3 separate languages, Old Persian, Akkadian, and the language of the Edomites. 3 separate languages, the same story about how he came in, put down the usurper, took back control of Persia, reinstituted their law and their order, and then freed all of these people that were under bondage by this pretender to the throne. This is a narrative that he keeps pushing, and this is how he spins it. And he marries not just one of Cyrus's daughters, but he marries 2 of them at the same time, plus he marries one of Cyrus's nieces. And interestingly, this just kind of shows you that this doesn't mean that Darius is a moral good character by any stretch of the means, or that the Persian kings were like that. One of his wives was married to her half-brother Cambyses. Don't mistake me for saying that he was when they say Darius the Great, doesn't mean he was a good person, right? But this is the lengths at which he will go to reestablish himself. And he's constantly referring to himself as heir to the kingdom. And he does this so that way his son Xerxes, which we'll read about later, never has his legitimacy questioned. And he's constantly referring to himself as the heir to the kingdom, but specifically to the imperial law of the Medes and the Persians. And like we talked earlier, the law of the Medes and the Persians is different from other empires at the time because it's designed to prevent instability that plagued previous empires and led to their downfall. Because that's why it's hammered over and over again in Scripture during this era. In Daniel 6, Esther chapter 1 sort of sets the tone, and large portions of these stories are dealing with the reality of dealing with this system of laws. Herodotus, interestingly, doesn't cover this, but he's a Greek writing from the outside. The Jewish perspective from the Bible is from inside the administration. Daniel and his friends are inside and inundated in this system of government. So is Esther and Mordecai. And so that's one reason that doesn't show up. But so thinking about what we know about that, what is the legal theory behind making edicts and laws that can't be undone? What biblical principles does this system of law actually mirror? Why would you set it up so that way, if I make a law, no one can change it? It doesn't seem like that's a really smart way to do business, but why would you do that? Why is this so important to Darius? Why is it so important to him that Cyrus did make a mandate and he knows that can't be changed and therefore the Jews have the right to continue building? What is the benefit of this system? Ronnie?
You have to convince that they're almost like gods, because if you make a law and it can't be undone, that's like saying, man, I'm perfect, I can't make mistakes.
Okay.
They have to view the pharaoh and the leader as that type of person in order to keep under control.
Okay, I think that's actually I hadn't even thought about that one. That's probably a big part of it. When you establish that the authority is forever and that it cannot be changed, then you are trying to sort of tie it to an infallibility that would be useful in strengthening power. Correct, BJ?
I mean, we see, looking at different religious organizations, how many times big doctrinal things have just been redacted and completely shifted to fit the culture that is around them. Truth is truth, right? And if truth can continue to be amended, as we see in a lot of different religious organizations, how do you have any confidence in what is actually right or wrong? That's why when we look at Scripture, it has been delivered once for all. It's not going to be amended. It's not going to be redacted. It's not going to change. And there's wisdom behind the way that God delivered the truth, for us to understand today.
And you see a lot of that wisdom being practiced by the Medes and Persians and how they approach it in a political standpoint, not in a religious standpoint.
Right, and I think that's a really good parallel. The other one that I was thinking of is when we talk about, when Christ says, "Let your yes be what?
Yes.
Yes, and your no be no." This idea that you need to think seriously about the things that you are committing to and the things that you are saying and make sure that they are true. And that's sort of the legal theory behind, on a political scale, what the Persians are trying to do here is that they're trying to create something that has a through thread that surpasses kings and chaos. We've had 4 kings that have risen and fallen. We've had a lot of, the people of Persia have a lot of turmoil going on because they don't know who's in charge. And this is the problem with empires: is if you got fighting going on, who's in charge? Who do I pay attention to? Who's gonna wake up this morning and change their mind about how they feel about X, Y, and Z? And so what it does is it provides consistency, and it forces the kings to think. Supposedly, it seems like we have a lot of instances of them not thinking before they sign these laws over. But the idea is that they will think long and hard about these laws, because once it's put into stone or clay, it cannot be undone. And so it's to provide a sense of stability to the realm, to provide a sense of something that you can call back to, which mirrors our call back to truth. It's their attempt to establish sort of an earthly political truth that they can rely on. And they recognize that's more important than who's king at any given time. Harold?
Well, about the law, if the law could be changed overnight, I mean, what good would it be, really? I mean, how much force would it have, and how great would it be? And you mentioned about the marriage of all these women. Of course, that Solomon had 1,000, and the reason for that, one of the big reasons for that, was he would marry kings in different countries' daughters, and therefore get them under him. They were pretty sharp when it comes to ruling. These kings were, and it's amazing that we got the records that from like over the year 5,000.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. If you have something actually written down and kept and preserved. Just all the wars they had and all the moving they had.
And not only that, but it's not just a generic record. It tells you that it happened on a Wednesday, is the thing that amazes me. But there's substance to this, because once it be made, it cannot be undone unless it's superseded. We have to be more careful with the consequences of things before passing an edict, and it prevents the next king from undoing previous king's edicts and creating more instability in a transition. It creates a legal framework for consistency. And so when he goes and responds in verse 6 through 12, "Now therefore Tattenai, governor of the province beyond the river, Sheth-Barazani, and your associates, the governors who are in the province beyond the river, keep away. Let the work of the house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild his house, this house of God on its site. Moreover, I make a decree regarding that you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of the house of God. The cost is to be paid to these men in full, without delay, from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province from beyond the river. And whatever is needed, bulls, rams, sheep, or burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, as the priests at Jerusalem require, let that be given to them day by day without fail, that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king, him, and his sons. Also, I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled upon it, and his house shall be made into a dunghill. May the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand to alter this, or to destroy the house of God that is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree. Let it be done with all due diligence." And so Darius's reply, he finds the previous law, which was ignored by Cambyses, and then he orders that it be followed. He's using this as an opportunity to draw a further line of distinction between his own adherence to the law of Medes and Persians and his predecessors' disregard and tyranny. and not only orders the Jews to be let alone, but that Tattenai, as the governor, is to see that the money that is required be paid out of the treasury. Because you remember Cyrus already promised them this is all going to be paid for. And so Darius is going a step beyond and saying, no, it needs to make sure that it comes out of your pocket. Make sure, so that way you can make sure that it gets to them. And that fulfills the letter of the law in Cyrus. But he goes above and beyond. It's not just money, it's anything that they require. Rams, bulls, goats, the things that they will need for sacrifice. That is supposed to, come from the treasury. He wants to make sure that that's taken care of. Wheat, salt, wine, oil for the priests, all the showbread ingredients that you would need, the things that they require for starting back up, which shows me that he's taken time to look into what the God of the Hebrews requires for his worship. He's been that thorough because he doesn't list a lot of unclean things. He doesn't list things that are off the wall and not associated with Jewish worship. He clearly has taken enough time to know exactly what they need to make sure that they have it. And moreover, anyone that tries to stop them is going to face a harsh punishment. So it not only allows the continuance of the building, but he mandates it. In the same order, he protects the Jews from their adversaries by saying, I'm going to take a beam and I'm going to shove it into your stomach and hold you up there, and then I'm going to turn the rest of your house into a pile of poo, is basically the language that he's using. BJ.
There's this beautiful moment of lex talionis here as well, this Hebrew symmetry, which is like the law of the tooth is what it's called. They're busy erecting beams in the walls of God's house. And God uses Darius to say, if anyone tries to prevent people from erecting beams in my house, I'm going to take a beam from your own house and impale you from it. And a lot of people miss that symmetry there, but I don't think it's there by accident. I think it's really incredible to see that contrast there that God brings out.
Absolutely. And just in closing for this section, so that way BJ can get back to, we're going to go back to the portion that pertains directly to the Hebrews. But I think that this ties back into the message that he's saying, the eye of God is upon them. God's sovereignty as king above all kings is once again shown. The remnant begins their work, and they don't stop when the governor's inspectors come up what they're doing. They're putting their faith back in God. He shows his faithfulness to them by using the rulers and the principalities of this area to his purpose. His timing is divine, as BJ alluded to earlier, and through the political realities of this Persian world, think about like the Jews from their perspective, they're just trying to build a temple. The stuff that we've talked about with Darius today and Tattenai, this is like world level stuff that God is using and shaping to provide stability and safety for his people to keep that promise. And so Darius becomes a tool for his purpose, even if he is ruling over almost half of the known world at the time. He is just a cog in God's ultimate design. And so by continuing in their charge, the people of Israel, they don't even know what Darius is going to say. It shows that they have learned the lessons of Haggai and Zechariah. They don't stop and wait for the king to get word back that gives them the clear, all go ahead. By putting their trust where it always should have been, the Lord provides the rest at the scale that an average Jew just couldn't comprehend or see at the time. We get to see it because Ezra has recorded it and shown us the scale at which God's sovereignty is present and the lengths at which he is going to make sure that his people are provided for. I know we're riding right it to the wire. Is there any last thoughts before we close for this morning? I know there's a lot to cram in there, but I think it's important to see the scale of God's sovereignty. All right, I appreciate everybody's participation and attention, and we will finish out Ezra chapter 6 and hopefully get into Ezra 7 on Wednesday. So looking forward to BJ taking that.